Without these tricks, medieval people would not have survived even a month. What did they do to combat the cold? We imagine the Middle Ages as an era of majestic castles and gloomy cold walls. We think of the people of that time as hardened and accustomed to deprivation, almost oblivious to the eternal cold. But what if I told you that every element of their homes, from floor to roof, was part of an ingenious and well-thought-out system for surviving in an icy hell? Not just shelters, but heat-preserving machines, built with a deep understanding of the laws of physics and the properties of natural materials. Behind the apparent simplicity lay technologies honed by centuries of trial and error, where every detail mattered. It was a daily, desperate battle for every degree of warmth, and architecture was their main weapon. This is not a story about kings' castles, but about simple houses built to escape the cold. Watch this video to the end, and you will learn how ordinary dirt underfoot became high-tech insulation and why a thatched roof was more effective than stone vaults. I will reveal the most closely guarded secret of the medieval home. We are used to thinking of the hearth as a symbol of comfort, but in the Middle Ages, it was a ruthless tyrant around which all life revolved. It was not just a stove, but the center of the universe, dictating architecture, daily life, and even social relations. Imagine a modern home where the only source of heat, light, and cooking was a gas burner in the middle of the living room, without a hood and with the constant threat of explosion. The medieval hearth created a similar situation. It was absolutely necessary for survival, but at the same time dictated the harshest conditions of existence. If you lived in a medieval house, you would quickly realize that you did not control the fire, but the fire controlled you, determining every aspect of your daily life. Houses were not built and then fitted with a hearth. They literally grew around the fire. It was the location of the hearth that determined where the walls would be, where people would sleep, and how the entire interior space would be organized. It was the alpha and omega of any construction, the first and most important element. The layout of a medieval house began with the choice of a place for the hearth, and everything else was adjusted to this central point. Builders took into account the direction of the winds so that the smoke would not blow back into the room, the proximity to sources of fuel and water, as well as the possibility of creating draft for smoke to escape. The walls were erected in such a way as to retain as much heat from the hearth as possible, and the windows and doors were positioned with the need to maintain the fire in mind. The floor construction also depended on the hearth. A stone or clay platform was built around it to protect the wooden floors from sparks and embers. The ceiling above the hearth was reinforced with special beams capable of withstanding high temperatures and possible ignition. Even the location of the sleeping places was calculated based on how the heat from the central fire would spread. All daytime activity was confined to the small patch of light and heat provided by the fire. Here, food was prepared, tools were repaired, and long winter evenings were spent. To move away from the hearth meant to plunge into cold and darkness. Proximity to the fire was a direct reflection of social status. The head of the family and honored guests occupied the warmest and most well-lit places. The rest of the household and servants huddled further away, in the semi-darkness and coolness. The radius of comfortable stay near the hearth was only 2 to 3 meters, which created constant competition for the best places. In large houses, this led to a clear hierarchy of seating. The master of the house sat closest to the fire. Next to him were his wife and eldest sons. Then the younger members of the family, while servants and apprentices had to make do with the residual heat near the walls. The psychology of the hearth hierarchy was so strong that even guests were seated strictly according to social status. Offering someone a place closer to the fire was a sign of special respect, while moving them further away was an insult. Children learned this system from an early age and knew their place in the hearth hierarchy. Fire required constant sacrifices in the form of fuel, the procurement of which was hard and continuous work. Wood was a precious resource, and the right to cut it down was strictly controlled. Every log thrown into the fire had its price. An open hearth without a chimney filled the room with acrid smoke, which escaped through a hole in the roof or simply seeped through the cracks. People lived in constant smog, which permeated their clothes, walls, and lungs. This was the daily price they paid for precious warmth. Firewood harvesting was one of the most labor-intensive tasks in medieval farming. A family of 4 to 5 people consumed up to 20 cubic meters of firewood in winter, which required felling, sawing, and transporting dozens of trees. The rights to cut down forests belonged to the feudal lords, and commoners could only collect dead wood or buy firewood at high prices. The quality of fuel was critical. Wet wood produced a lot of smoke and little heat. Conifers shot sparks, and deciduous trees burned evenly but quickly burned out. Families developed complex strategies for using different types of fuel depending on the time of day and weather conditions. The constant presence of smoke in the house led to chronic respiratory diseases. Medieval people suffered from coughs, bronchitis, and eye problems. Smoke permeated everything: clothes, bedding, food. The walls were covered with a thick layer of soot that was almost impossible to remove. But smoke was not the only danger. Sparks flying from the fire could ignite wooden structures or thatch roofs at any moment. Living near a hearth was literally playing with fire. The psychological significance of fire was enormous. It was not only a source of heat, but also protection from the darkness and the fears it brought. A dying hearth in the middle of the night was the worst of nightmares. Fires were a constant threat, especially in wooden houses with thatched roofs. Statistics show that in medieval cities, fires destroyed entire neighborhoods several times a century. Families developed special safety procedures. Someone had to keep watch over the fire at night. Containers of water or sand were kept around the hearth, and before going to bed, the fire was carefully covered with ashes. Sparks were especially dangerous during cooking, when fat from meat could flare up and scatter burning drops throughout the house. Women wore long aprons made of thick fabric and learned to quickly extinguish small fires with improvised means. In the medieval mind, fire had mystical properties. It drove away evil spirits, cleansed diseases, and connected the living with the world of their ancestors. An extinguished hearth meant not only cold and hunger, but also spiritual vulnerability for the home. Therefore, many families maintained an eternal fire, never allowing it to go out completely. Thus, the hearth was not a servant of man, but his master. It gave life, but in return demanded complete submission, determining every step and every aspect of daily life. It was a deal that people made in order to simply survive another winter. This domestic tyrant was the heart of the home. But how did the building itself help to preserve its precious warmth? What do you think was the biggest drawback of living with an open hearth in the center of the house? What if I told you that everything you believed about medieval life was wrong? The idea of personal space and privacy was foreign to the vast majority of people of that era. The basis of their dwellings, from peasant huts to feudal manors, was one huge hall where everyone lived together. Imagine a modern loft studio where a large family of 3 generations lives, including grandparents, parents, children, and even servants, all in one space without partitions. Medieval houses functioned on this very principle, but not because of fashionable architectural trends, but because of the harsh necessity of survival. If you had lived at that time, you would have understood that privacy was a luxury that only the wealthiest could afford, and even they often gave it up for warmth and safety. This principle of one space was dictated not by poverty, but by harsh necessity. It was impossible to heat several rooms with a single fireplace. It was easier and more efficient to gather everyone in one large room. All the inhabitants of the house ate, worked, socialized, and slept in this hall. The owners could partition off a corner with a screen or curtain, but this was only an illusion of privacy. Sounds and smells were shared by everyone. The physics of heat distribution from a central hearth was unforgiving. Every additional wall and partition created cold zones where precious heat could not reach. Engineers of the time intuitively understood the principles of heat transfer and designed houses as unified heating systems, where each element worked to maximize the conservation and distribution of heat from a single source. The social structure of a medieval house reflected its physical layout. The family hierarchy was manifested not in separate rooms, but in the location of sleeping places relative to the hearth. The head of the family slept closest to the fire, his wife next to him, the children a little further away, and the servants and workers were content with the coldest corners by the walls. This layout turned the house into a kind of human beehive. People warmed the space not only with the fire in the hearth, but also with the warmth of their own bodies. On cold nights, this collective warmth was an important factor for survival. The walls of such halls were built from available materials, most often using frame technology. Wooden beams formed the skeleton of the building. The space between them was filled with whatever was literally underfoot. The human body emits about 100 watts of heat energy, which when 115 people gathered in one room, provided an additional kilowatt of heating. This biological heating system was especially important at night. When the fire in the hearth was dampened for safety reasons, people slept in groups, using shared blankets and each other's body heat to maintain a comfortable temperature. The collective sleeping system was so effective that even wealthy families often preferred to sleep together in one large bed rather than in separate cold bedrooms. This explains the size of some medieval beds, which could accommodate 6 to 8 people at a time. This filler, known as adobe or mud, consisted of a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and manure. It was cheap, accessible, and as we will see later, had amazing properties. It was this simple mixture that was the main protection against the cold. There were usually no internal partitions. Any wall would interfere with the circulation of warm air from the hearth. The space had to be unified and open. The technology for making adobe was refined over centuries of experimentation and passed down from generation to generation. The right proportions of clay, sand, and organic materials created a composite with unique properties. It was strong, flexible, heat insulating, and breathable. Manure was added for a reason. It contained fibers that reinforced the mixture, as well as enzymes that promoted proper drying of the material. The process of building walls required the participation of the entire community. Men prepared materials and erected the frame, while women and children participated in mixing adobe and applying it to the walls. It was a social ritual that united people around the common goal of creating a warm home. This way of life blurred the boundaries between the personal and the public. Everyone was visible, and every moment of life was spent in the presence of others. This formed a completely different mentality based on collectivism. The Great Hall was not just an architectural solution, but a social model. It united people in the face of a common enemy, the cold. And in this struggle, unity was the key to survival. The psychology of collective housing created special forms of social control and mutual support. The inability to hide from others meant that any antisocial behavior immediately became known to everyone. On the other hand, this ensured constant care for the weak and sick. No one could be left without help in such a close-knit community. The lack of privacy was compensated for by a developed system of nonverbal communication and social rituals that allowed people to coexist in a confined space. Medieval people developed special skills of selective attention, knowing how to ignore what was not meant for their eyes and ears. But how exactly did walls made of mud and straw work? Are you ready for the shocking truth that these primitive materials were more effective than stone? In the next chapter, we will reveal the secret of breathing walls. What I am about to show you is prohibited in 12 countries in the modern construction industry. We are accustomed to thinking of medieval adobe walls as a primitive and unreliable technology. But in fact, it was a complex and ingeniously balanced system that solved several problems at once. Imagine a modern high-tech house with climate control, heated floors, and multi-layer insulation. A medieval adobe wall performed all these functions at once, using only natural materials and centuries of builders' experience. If modern architects tried to recreate all the functions of a medieval wall using modern technology, they would need systems costing tens of thousands of dollars, which would consume electricity around the clock. The main component of such a wall was straw or reeds. This material did not simply reinforce the clay, making it stronger. It created myriads of tiny air pockets inside the wall. It was this trapped air that was the main insulator. It worked on the same principle as modern mineral wool or foam plastic. Medieval builders intuitively used one of the most effective insulators, still air. The microstructure of an adobe wall was remarkably complex for such a simple material. Each straw created not one, but many air pockets of different sizes, from large cavities between the stems to the smallest pores in the plant tissue itself. This multi-level insulation system provided a thermal conductivity coefficient comparable to modern insulation materials. The choice of straw or reed type was critically important. Experienced builders knew that rye straw was better than wheat straw because its stalks were more hollow inside. Reed was valued even more highly because of its tubular structure, which created ideal air channels. The length of the straw was also important. Too short and it did not create a strong enough reinforcement. Too long and it was difficult to distribute evenly in the mixture. But that was only half the secret. The mixture of clay and organic materials was highly hygroscopic. This means that the wall could absorb excess moisture from the air in the room. This property allowed the humidity inside the house to be regulated. When the air became too dry, the wall released moisture back into it. In this way, it functioned as a primitive but effective climate control system. The humidity control mechanism was based on the capillary properties of clay and the porous structure of organic materials. The wall could absorb up to 30% of its own weight in moisture without losing its insulating properties. This process took place gradually. The wall reacted to changes in humidity over several hours, creating a stable microclimate in the room. The optimal humidity for humans is 40–60%, and adobe walls automatically maintain this level. When the humidity rose above normal, for example during cooking or washing, the wall absorbed the excess. When the air dried out from the work of the hearth, the wall gave back the accumulated moisture. Such breathable walls prevented the appearance of dampness and mold, which were a real scourge of stone castles. The air in an adobe house was much healthier. Stone walls, on the contrary, condensed moisture, creating a cold and damp atmosphere. The outer layer of the walls was often covered with lime whitewash. Lime is a natural antiseptic that protected the wall from pests. In addition, the white color reflected the sun's rays in summer, preventing the house from overheating. The contrast with stone buildings was striking. Stone castles constantly struggled with condensation that formed on cold walls. Moisture ran down the stone, creating puddles on the floor and promoting the growth of mold and moss. The air in stone rooms was often musty and unhealthy, leading to respiratory diseases among the inhabitants. Lime whitewash was not just a decorative coating, but an important functional element of the system. Lime had bactericidal and fungicidal properties, destroying pathogenic microorganisms on the surface of the wall. In addition, it created an additional protective layer against rain and wind, extending the life of the adobe. The thickness of the walls was also of great importance. They were massive, sometimes up to half a meter thick. This mass had high thermal inertia. During the day, the wall slowly accumulated heat from the hearth and sunlight. At night, it slowly released this heat back into the room. This smoothed out daily temperature fluctuations and saved fuel. The principle of thermal inertia was key to medieval heating technology. A half-meter adobe wall weighed several tons per linear meter and had enormous heat capacity. Heating up during the day, it turned into a giant heat accumulator that slowly released the stored energy throughout the night. This effect was especially noticeable in winter, when the difference between day and night temperatures was greatest. In a house with thin walls, the temperature could fluctuate by 10–15 degrees during the day. In a house with thick adobe walls, these fluctuations did not exceed 3–5 degrees, creating much more comfortable living conditions. The fuel savings from using thermal inertia were significant, up to 30–40% compared to houses with thin walls. This meant that the family could prepare less firewood for the winter or use the saved fuel for other needs. Thus, the adobe wall was not just a protective structure, it was a multifunctional system that provided thermal insulation, humidity control, and heat accumulation. It was a simple, inexpensive, and incredibly effective technology, perfectly suited to its task. What if I showed you a time machine to a world where windows were a luxury? Modern people cannot imagine a house without large, bright windows. But in the Middle Ages, every opening in the wall was an enemy through which precious heat escaped. Therefore, windows were made as small as possible and placed as high as possible. Their small size minimized heat loss. Their high position allowed cold air entering the room to mix with warm air near the ceiling without creating a draft below. Glass was an incredibly expensive and rare material, available only to churches and palaces. In ordinary houses, window openings were covered with wooden shutters. At night and in bad weather, they were closed tightly, plunging the house into complete darkness. To let in a little light but keep out the wind, cheaper alternatives to glass were used. Openings could be covered with oiled cloth or parchment. Sometimes thinly scraped plates of horn were used. These materials were translucent but not transparent. They let in dim, diffused light but did not allow you to see what was happening outside. The world outside the window was blurred and unclear. Doorways were another source of drafts. To combat this, wealthy homes hung heavy wool or tapestry curtains on the walls. They created an additional barrier to cold air. These tapestries were not just decoration, but a functional element of thermal insulation. They covered the cold stone walls, creating an air gap and reducing heat loss. The richer the house, the more layers of fabric there were on its walls. The entrance to the house was often arranged through a vestibule or porch. This created a buffer zone that prevented cold air from the street from entering the living space directly. The principle of double doors is still used in architecture today. The floor was another source of cold. To insulate it, the floors were covered with a thick layer of straw or reeds. In winter, this layer could reach a considerable thickness, turning into a kind of indoor carpet. This constant battle against drafts turned the house into a kind of airtight fortress. But after sealing all the cracks, they faced another problem: cold coming from below. How did they solve this problem, and why were their floors made of earth? We are accustomed to thinking of earthen floors as a sign of extreme poverty. However, in the context of a medieval house, it was a well-thought-out engineering solution. A floor made of compacted clay had important thermal properties. The ground beneath a house has a relatively stable temperature throughout the year. In winter, it is significantly warmer than the outside air. Earthen floors allow this geothermal heat to be used to heat the home. A stone floor, on the other hand, would be a thermal bridge, drawing heat out of the house. It would quickly cool down to the temperature of the outside air. Therefore, stone was rarely used for floors in living quarters. The earthen floor was covered with a layer of insulating materials. Most often, this was straw, reeds, or dry leaves. This layer not only insulated the floor, but also absorbed moisture and dirt. This plant-based carpet was periodically renewed by simply adding a new layer on top. The lower layers rotted over time, creating additional heat. It was a simple and effective insulation system. If the floor was the first line of defense against the cold coming from below, then the roof was the last line of defense, keeping the heat inside. Here, too, medieval builders used an ingenious solution. The vast majority of roofs were thatched. A thick layer of straw or reeds laid on a wooden frame is an excellent heat insulator. The air trapped between millions of dry stalks created a powerful barrier to heat loss. Such a roof retained heat much better than a tile or slate roof. The steep slope of the roof was also no accident. It allowed rainwater and snow to roll off quickly, preventing moisture from penetrating the straw covering. Dry straw is a good insulator, wet straw is a poor one. The main disadvantage of such a roof was its fire hazard. A single spark from the hearth could destroy the entire house in a matter of minutes. It was a constant and deadly threat that had to be accepted. Thus, the floor and roof were key elements of the heat conservation system. They were made from the simplest and most accessible materials, but their effectiveness was the result of centuries of survival experience. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of medieval bedrooms? Looking at the huge halls and castles, we imagine a life full of space. But in reality, when it came to sleep and rest, medieval people sought out the smallest and most enclosed spaces possible. This desire was dictated by the same logic of heat conservation. It was practically impossible to heat a large bedroom. It was much easier to create a local warm area within a large room. This is how the bed niche or alcove came about. It was a small recess in the wall where the sleeping area was located. 3 walls and a ceiling already created a space protected from drafts. An even more effective solution was a wardrobe bed or box bed. It was a completely enclosed wooden structure with doors or thick curtains. At night, a person would climb inside, as if into a small room. The warmth of the human body quickly heated the small volume of air inside such a bed. In fact, a person slept in an individual, self-heating microclimate. This made it possible to survive even in unheated rooms. Even ordinary beds in wealthy homes always had a canopy. Heavy curtains surrounding the bed on all sides served the same function. They blocked drafts and retained heat, creating a cozy cocoon. This love for small spaces was also reflected in the layout. Large houses and castles often used wooden partitions and screens. They allowed a huge hall to be divided into several smaller areas that were easier to heat. Rooms were arranged one above the other. Bedrooms were often located above the kitchen or a large hall. The heat rising from below warmed the floor and made the upper room more comfortable. This matryoshka strategy, creating small warm areas inside large cold ones, was key to survival. It allowed precious heat to be concentrated where it was most needed. It was architecture based on common sense. People created warm cocoons out of wood and fabric, but that wasn't enough. How did they turn themselves into walking thermoses? In the next chapter, we'll talk about clothing, which was as much a part of the home as the walls or roof. In the Middle Ages, the boundary between clothing and home was blurred. When walls could not provide enough warmth, clothing became the last line of defense. It was personal, wearable architecture that a person never completely took off. Imagine a situation where your house is so cold that you have to wear a winter jacket even in bed. Medieval people lived in such conditions all the time. Their clothing functioned as a personal life support system that had to compensate for the lack of heating in their homes. If you found yourself in a medieval house in winter wearing modern lightweight clothing, you would quickly realize that each layer of fabric was not a luxury, but a necessity for survival in conditions where the temperature inside could drop to zero. The concept of clothing as mobile architecture was revolutionary for its time. While buildings remained static and did not always provide effective protection from the cold, clothing allowed people to create a microclimate around themselves that they could control and adapt to changing conditions. It was the first personal climate control system in history. Wool was the main material used for clothing. It was the ideal material for cold climates. Wool fibers have a hollow structure that traps air, creating an insulating layer. Moreover, wool is able to absorb moisture while remaining dry to the touch. It also retains its thermal insulation properties even when wet. No other natural material possessed such a combination of qualities. Wool fibers have a unique molecular structure that makes them ideal for thermoregulation. Each fiber is covered with tiny scales that create additional air pockets. In addition, wool contains natural lanolin, a waxy substance that repels water but allows the material to breathe. Medieval craftsmen learned to process wool in such a way as to make the most of its natural properties. The felting process created a dense fabric in which the fibers interlocked to form a virtually windproof barrier. At the same time, the material remained flexible and retained its ability to absorb and wick moisture away from the body. The principle of layering was well known and widely used. A linen shirt was worn next to the skin to absorb sweat. One or more woolen tunics were worn over it. Heavy cloaks and capes made of thick cloth served as outerwear. The hood was an integral part of the outerwear. It protected not only the head from the cold, but also the neck and shoulders, areas through which a lot of heat escapes. The system of layered clothing was scientifically sound, although medieval people did not know the laws of thermodynamics. Each layer served a specific function. Linen shirts wick moisture away from the skin and prevent irritation. Wool tunics create insulating air pockets, and outer cloaks protect against wind and precipitation. The hood was a particularly important element, as up to 40% of body heat is lost through the head. Medieval hoods were deep and spacious, often with long ends that could be wrapped around the neck. Some hoods had fur lining or trim, which further increased their insulating properties. People did not undress when they came home, as we do. In cold dwellings, they continued to wear most of their clothes. Only the top layer worn outside was removed. People even slept fully clothed. They went to bed in their undergarments. They often wore nightcaps to reduce heat loss while sleeping. The concept of home clothes, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. What we call changing clothes at home would have been an act of suicide for a medieval person during the cold season. The temperature difference between the street and the house was often only a few degrees, so it was logical to keep most of your heat-protective wardrobe on. Nightcaps were not a fashion fad, but a vital element of survival. During sleep, the metabolism slows down and the body produces less heat. Without headgear, a person could wake up with frostbite or become seriously ill. Caps were often made of several layers of fabric or lined with fur. The materials and quality of clothing, of course, depended heavily on social status. Peasants wore coarse, undyed wool. The nobility could afford fine cloth, furs, and silk linings. But the principle remained the same: as many layers as possible made from the warmest materials. Clothing was not so much a means of self-expression as a vital tool. It was the last, most reliable refuge from the cold. Caring for woolen clothing was a complex and laborious process. Wool could not be washed often, as it would lose its shape and properties. Instead, clothes were regularly aired, cleaned with brushes, and treated with herbs to protect against moths and parasites. Wealthy families had special servants who were exclusively responsible for caring for clothing. Winter completely changed not only the architecture, but also the very rhythm of life for medieval people. All daily life was compressed, concentrated around the only source of heat and light, the hearth. It was a time of slowing down and waiting. Daylight hours were short, and artificial lighting was expensive and dim. Torches and tallow candles provided little light and a lot of soot. Therefore, most work was done before nightfall. Winter evenings were long and dark. The family gathered around the fire, doing monotonous work that did not require good lighting. Men repaired harnesses and tools, while women spun or mended clothes. It was a time for oral stories, legends, and songs. In the absence of other entertainment, the spoken word was the main way to pass the time. The hearth became not only the center of warmth, but also the center of culture. The diet also changed. Fresh vegetables and fruits disappeared. The table was dominated by pickles, smoked meats, dried meat, and grains, foods that could be stored for future use. Food became fattier and more caloric. This was necessary to give the body enough energy to fight the cold. Hot soup or porridge was not just food, but a source of internal warmth. Physical activity outside was reduced to a minimum. Any outing in the cold was risky and required serious preparation. People tried not to leave their shelters unnecessarily. Work that could be done indoors was valued like gold. Winter was a time for crafts that did not require a lot of space. It was a time for weaving and mending. The entire life of the family and community was synchronized with the cycles of nature. Winter was a period of hibernation, of gathering strength before the spring awakening. It was a time when one simply had to survive. The house was not just a place to live, but an ark floating through the icy ocean of winter. Every element of it and every aspect of life was subordinated to one goal. That goal was to live to see spring. Although the cold was a common enemy for everyone, the means of combating it differed radically depending on social status. Winter for a peasant and winter for a feudal lord were two different worlds. The difference lay in access to two main resources: fuel and space. A peasant family lived in a small house, often built on the principle of a longhouse. People lived in one part, and livestock lived in the other, separated by a thin partition. The heat given off by the animals was an important additional source of heating. Fuel was a constant problem for peasants. The forest belonged to the feudal lord, and only fallen trees could be collected. To heat the house and cook food, they had to use anything that could burn, including peat and dried manure. The feudal lord's dwelling, whether a manor or a castle, was much larger. But its large size was more of a disadvantage. It was almost impossible to heat the huge stone halls. Fireplaces began to appear in castles, a more sophisticated device than an open hearth. The fireplace had a chimney that removed smoke, but along with the smoke, most of the heat also escaped. The efficiency of such fireplaces was extremely low. The walls in castles were made of stone, which made them cold and damp. To keep warm in some way, the walls were hung with expensive tapestries. The floors were covered with carpets brought from the east. The feudal lord had unlimited access to firewood from his own forest. Huge logs could burn in fireplaces for days. But even this fiery storm could not always overcome the stone cold of the giant halls. Clothing also demonstrated this gap. Peasants wore coarse wool and straw-filled bast shoes. Feudal lords and their families wrapped themselves in furs, velvet, and fine cloth. Even food was different. Peasants ate simple porridge and bread. The feudal lord's table was laden with fatty meats and warming wines. Thus, although both the poor and the rich suffered from the cold, their ability to resist it was incomparable. For some, winter was a time of struggle for survival. For others, it was a time of discomfort that could be alleviated with money. The medieval house was not a static structure. It evolved slowly but surely. The main driver of this evolution was man's relentless pursuit of comfort. Two inventions played a key role in this transformation. The first and most important invention was the chimney. Moving the hearth from the center of the room to the wall and enclosing it in a fireplace with a pipe was a real revolution. This allowed smoke to be effectively removed from the room. A smoke-free house became much more livable. This made it possible to build two-story houses, as smoke no longer prevented the use of the upper space. Architecture began to move in a vertical direction. The second key change was the spread of glass. Initially expensive, it became more affordable over time. Glazed windows allowed light into the house without letting in the cold. Houses became brighter and visually more spacious. There was no longer any need to live in semi-darkness or by the light of dim candles. This changed not only people's everyday lives, but also their psychology. Rooms with specific functions began to appear. Instead of one large hall, there were bedrooms, living rooms, and studies. The idea of personal space and privacy began to penetrate people's lives. Heating systems also developed. The first tiled stoves appeared, which retained heat for a long time and were much more efficient than open fireplaces. They became the centerpieces of new, more comfortable interiors. Wall materials also changed. Brick gradually replaced adobe and wood. Brick walls were stronger and more durable. This evolution was slow and uneven. New technologies first appeared in the homes of wealthy townspeople and nobility. In villages, old traditions persisted for centuries. Nevertheless, the general direction had been set. The house ceased to be merely a machine for survival. It began to transform into what it is for us today, a space for comfortable and private living. We have taken a journey into the past and seen that medieval houses were not just primitive structures. They were complex, well-thought-out systems designed for survival in harsh conditions. Behind every detail lay centuries of wisdom and the experience of generations. From the central hearth to the breathing walls, from the thatched roof to the bed cupboard, everything was subordinated to one main goal: preserving precious heat. Medieval man did not conquer nature, but learned to live in harmony with it, using its gifts for his own protection. This story is not about technological progress, but about the power of human ingenuity. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new episodes.